The lingering scent of espresso and damp Seattle wool was violently shattered. 4 towering figures in matching dark suits marched into the harbor grind, their presence extinguishing all conversation. They weren't looking for a coffee or a criminal. They were looking for David Chen, the tired minimum wage waiter who had done nothing more than cut a lonely old man's toast. David was pulled from his apron and thrust into the back of a luxury sedan heading toward the highest towers in the financial district. The old man, Mr. Alistair Sterling, was dead, but his last act of faith was about to shake the foundations of his billion-dollar empire, pitting the exhausted waiter against the ruthless greed of the Sterling dynasty. David was about to discover that his small act of kindness was written into a will, making him the inheritor of a battle he never asked for. If you are moved by stories where integrity challenges power, please support us by subscribing to the channel. The rain in Seattle was less of a shower and more of a constant whispering presence, a fine cold mist that clung to the windows of the harbor grind and soaked the collar of David Chen's thin jacket every morning before his shift. It was November of 2025, and David, at 32 years old, felt the persistent dampness in his bones and more acutely in his bank account. The harbor grind was one of those classic Seattle coffee houses, dim lighting the scent of espresso and stale pastries and a persistent hum of low-key exhaustion. David wasn't meant to be here. He had trained for years to be a chef, his hands skilled and precise, dreaming of running a clean, vibrant kitchen. Instead, his skills were currently employed washing grease from stainless steel and wiping down sticky tabletops. Since his wife passed away in 2023, leaving him as the sole provider for their son, Jake David had traded his chef whites for a worn apron and the stability of a minimum wage job with predictable hours. Stability, however, came at the cost of sleep and dignity. His shift started at 5:00 a.m. Every day, David would leave his tiny, worn apartment before the city truly woke up, the darkness heavy and silent. He navigated the quiet streets, his mind constantly turning over the logistics of fatherhood and debt. The rent is due on the 1st. Jake needs new boots. Is there enough left for the gas bill? This mental grind was often heavier than the actual work. The first wave of customers, the serious commuters, the early risers, rolled in around 6:30 a.m. Among them, always punctual, always silent, was Mr. Alistair Sterling. Mr. Sterling was an imposing figure even in his late 70s. He wore expensive tailored wool coats that seemed impervious to the Seattle drizzle, and his silver hair was always impeccably neat. He never sat by the window. He always chose the same small, secluded corner table, a spot that offered him a view of the street without inviting conversation. He was a creature of routine: a single black coffee, a lightly toasted English muffin, and 5 minutes of silent contemplation before pulling a leather-bound notebook from his coat. He was to all the staff an enigma, reserved, demanding, and often radiating a low-level irritation. Most of the young servers avoided him. David, needing the tips and the job, simply kept his interactions professional and brief. It was during a particularly slow Thursday morning in early November 2025 that David noticed it. He was dropping off Mr. Sterling's usual order. As Mr. Sterling reached for the small, flimsy plastic knife to split his English muffin, David saw a distinct, uncontrollable tremor in his hand. It wasn't a sudden shake. It was a constant low-grade vibration that made gripping the knife handle nearly impossible. Mr. Sterling tried to hide it, pressing his elbow close to his side, but the muffin nearly slipped off the plate. David recognized the signs of essential tremor, or perhaps mild Parkinson's conditions common in the elderly that make simple motor tasks a frustrating battle. He saw the brief, sharp flash of humiliation in the old man's eyes before Mr. Sterling quickly lowered his gaze. David walked away, serving another customer. He was supposed to be rushing, but a small, silent calculation was happening in his mind. He was tired, he was broke, and he was overworked, yet he remembered the look in Mr. Sterling's eyes. When David returned to the service counter, he quickly grabbed a fresh plate, a new English muffin, and a clean knife. He didn't ask his manager. Using the precision he had honed in professional kitchens, he gently sliced the muffin into 4 perfect small squares. They weren't quartered haphazardly. They were arranged neatly, deliberately, requiring no effort from the person eating them. He approached Mr. Sterling's table. "Excuse me, sir," David said quietly, placing the freshly prepared plate next to the trembling hand. "The kitchen made a mistake with your previous order. This one is prepared correctly." Mr. Sterling looked up, his gray eyes narrowed slightly, betraying suspicion. He stared at the 4 neat squares, then back at David, waiting for an explanation or an apology. David simply nodded, offered a silent, respectful look that conveyed, "I see your struggle, and I fixed it." He didn't wait for a response. He turned and walked back to the counter, leaving the old man alone with his perfectly sliced meal. The next morning, Mr. Sterling ordered the same thing. David didn't ask, didn't wait. He simply prepared the English muffin exactly the same way and delivered it with the same quiet dignity. The ritual began. For weeks, this silent exchange continued. David's gesture required an extra minute of his precious time, but it cost him nothing. He never glanced at the table to see if it was appreciated, focusing instead on his unending chores. Yet, every day the plate was clean when he cleared it. The daily grind continued for David, the bills, the sleepless nights, the constant anxiety. He was just surviving. Then, one cold, damp Tuesday, in late November 2025, Mr. Sterling broke the silence. David had placed the prepared plate down and was turning away when the old man's voice, surprisingly resonant and deep, stopped him. "Mr. Chen." David froze, turning back. He expected a complaint about the coffee temperature or the service. Mr. Sterling did not look at the plate. He looked directly at David. His intense gaze softened, almost searching. "That boy of yours, Jake." Mr. Sterling began, his voice dry but carrying a rare sincerity. "How is he faring with the change in the school district?" David blinked, genuinely taken aback. He hadn't realized Mr. Sterling even knew his son's name, let alone was aware of the recent stressful move they'd made to a cheaper neighborhood. David had mentioned the issue briefly and in passing to another server weeks ago. He is adjusting, sir," David replied, slightly defensive but touched. "It's a big shift, but he's a tough kid." Mr. Sterling nodded slowly, resting his hands on the table, tremor visible only slightly now. He watched David, then looked down at the neatly cut muffin. "Sometimes," Mr. Sterling said, his voice dropping to a near whisper, "the most valuable things are those that are never asked for." He paused, lifting the first small square of toast to his mouth with practiced ease. "Keep a tight hold on those things, Mr. Chen. Keep a tight hold on them." David nodded, a wave of profound weariness and unexpected recognition washing over him. It wasn't praise. It was an acknowledgement, a shared understanding of a burden, a connection forged not through words, but through the simple, selfless act of cutting toast. The rain continued to fall outside the harbor grind, but for the first time in a long time, David felt a small, fragile spark of warmth bloom in the damp cold. The days accelerated, blending into weeks of steam clattering ceramics and the unrelenting gray of the Seattle sky. Since the day Mr. Alistair Sterling had spoken that quiet phrase about things unasked for a subtle shift had occurred. Mr. Sterling still carried his reserved air, but he sometimes offered David a small, nearly invisible nod when the sliced English muffin arrived. David, in turn, found himself speaking a few more words than strictly necessary, a short observation about the weather or a quick, bright story about Jake's latest drawing. The true test of their unusual bond arrived 2 weeks before Christmas 2025. David's usual neighbor and sitter, a kind woman named Mrs. Elena, called just after David had stepped out the door for his shift. Her voice was strained. "David, I'm so sorry. My grandson came down with a bad flu overnight. I can't risk exposing little Jake. I have to cancel today." David's heart sank, hitting the floor of the subway car he was riding. Missing a shift was unthinkable. The manager was already looking for reasons to cut hours. David rushed home, explained the situation quickly to Jake, who was still sleepy and wrapped in his Spider-Man blanket, and made the agonizing decision. Buddy Dad has to work. David knelt down, pulling Jake's coat tight. We're going to the cafe. You need to be my best co-pilot, okay? Sit quietly to do your coloring and keep your Spider-Man senses sharp. Jake, wide-eyed with excitement over the sudden adventure, nodded eagerly. Walking into the harbor grind with Jake clutching his hand felt like walking onto a stage where he'd forgotten his lines. The manager glared. The other servers whispered. David quickly settled Jake at a small unused booth near the kitchen, providing him with crayons paper and a strict rule stay put. The morning rush hit hard, but David's gaze kept flickering to the booth. Jake was occupied drawing furiously, his tongue poking out in concentration. At 7:15 a.m. sharp, the bell chimed. Mr. Sterling walked in, paused slightly as he shed his damp wool coat, and strode toward his corner table. He sat down, the usual fortress of solitude around him. David took a deep breath, preparing Mr. Sterling's coffee and the sliced muffin. As he approached the corner table, he felt a fresh wave of embarrassment. "Good morning, sir. I apologize for the extra noise today. My sitter canceled last minute. My son is in that booth, but I promise he won't bother anyone." Mr. Sterling looked up. He didn't look at David, though. His gaze was fixed on the small, dark-haired boy coloring intently near the kitchen. He studied Jake for a long moment, those usually cold gray eyes softening into something distant, perhaps wistful. "That is Jake, I presume," Mr. Sterling said, his voice surprisingly gentle. "Yes, sir." Mr. Sterling leaned back, looking around the crowded, noisy cafe. He then looked back at David, and something in his expression changed. A decision had been made. "Mr. Chen," he stated, his voice carrying the calm authority of a man used to being obeyed. "Bring the boy here. He may share this table with me." David was stunned. "Sir, are you sure he's only 6? He might—" "I'm quite sure," Mr. Sterling interrupted, using David's first name for the first time. "It's a busy day. Bring him over." With a rush of disbelief and gratitude, David escorted Jake to the corner table. Jake, usually shy, looked up at the distinguished old man, his curiosity outweighing his fear. "Hello, sir. I'm Jake." "Hello, Jake," Alistair, Mr. Sterling replied, offering the boy a slight, genuine smile. "Are you drawing me today?" "No, sir, I'm drawing a space dragon," Jake announced proudly. The next 2 hours were unlike anything David had ever witnessed. Mr. Sterling, the demanding titan of isolation, shed his armor. He asked Jake about his space dragon, listened patiently to a long, convoluted explanation of its fire breath, and then transitioned effortlessly into a discussion of why a 6-legged dragon would need superior aerodynamics. David watched mesmerized as Mr. Sterling began to quiz Jake on addition, his deep voice filled with a grandfatherly patience. Mr. Sterling was clearly delighted when Jake correctly answered a tricky math question. The solitude that usually enveloped the corner table had been broken by an innocent, pure kind of joy. When Jake began to yawn, around 10 near a.m., rubbing his tired eyes, David knew it was time. He approached the table. "Mr. Sterling, thank you so much. We have to go now. I really appreciate you letting him sit here." Mr. Sterling nodded, his hand resting lightly on the boy's head. "He is a fine boy, David." Later that day, after returning home and tucking Jake into bed for an afternoon nap, David sat down, the adrenaline finally wearing off. He thought about the upcoming holiday. It would be lonely, just him and Jake trying to make the most of their meager budget. The next morning, when Mr. Sterling arrived, David prepared his plate and muffins, still slightly overwhelmed by yesterday's kindness. As Mr. Sterling finished his coffee, David approached, gathering his courage. The words tumbled out quickly, nervously. "Mr. Sterling, sir, Christmas is coming up. I know you have family and I don't want to intrude. But if you are free, Jake, and I would be honored if you would join us for Christmas dinner. Our apartment is small and I'm just cooking a simple meal, but it would be warmer with you there." Mr. Sterling looked up. His usual answer, the distant referral to his own busy family, died on his lips. He thought of the grand, obligation-filled parties he was expected to attend, the sharp edges of his nephew Victor's ambition, and his sister-in-law Eleanor's polite but frosty indifference. He thought of the silent, lonely perfection of his penthouse apartment. Then he thought of Jake's bright eyes and the warmth radiating from David's simple, genuine invitation. David, Mr. Sterling said, using his first name again, his voice softer than usual. I accept. Thank you. Christmas Day 2025 arrived gray and misty as expected, but inside David's small, crowded apartment the atmosphere was a haven. The tiny tree was adorned with Jake's homemade paper ornaments, and the scent of roasting chicken filled the air. Mr. Sterling arrived promptly carrying a modest box of high-quality chocolates for Jake. He sat on David's oldest armchair, watching the simple chaos of a father and son preparing dinner. He watched them laugh over a dropped dishcloth, saw the ease with which David corrected Jake, and felt the genuine love permeating the small space. During dinner, as Jake spoke excitedly about his presence, Mr. Sterling remained quiet, observing everything. When Jake was finally distracted, David looked at Mr. Sterling, seeing the deep melancholy beneath the composure. "Sir, is everything all right?" "You seem—" Mr. Sterling put down his fork, his eyes fixed on the flickering candles David had placed on the table. "David, I have a family," he said, his voice raw with a profound, almost desperate loneliness. "They are my blood. They live grand lives, lives I provided for them. They will visit me, they will call. But they are too busy with the life I created for them. They have forgotten how to simply be with someone. They see me as an institution, a source. I am just an ornament in their schedule, a thing to check off the holiday list." He gestured around David's humble living room filled with warmth and hand-me-down furniture. Here he concluded, his gaze steady on David. "Here I am simply Alistair. I feel seen. I feel for the first time in years that I truly belong to something, even if I am an outsider in this beautiful, honest mess." David didn't speak, merely placing his hand over Mr. Sterling's on the table, the same comforting gesture he used with Jake when the boy was troubled. The profound confession hung in the air, a seal on their unusual friendship. For Mr. Sterling, the decision was made. This moment, this oasis of simple, pure connection, was the legacy he needed to protect. The wealth he commanded could be trusted to no one but the man who understood the value of an unasked-for kindness. The tranquility of the shared Christmas dinner lingered with David. Mr. Sterling's visit had done more than just warm their small apartment. It had placed a small, steady anchor in David's chaotic life. The old man hadn't visited the cafe every day after the holiday, but when he did appear, the atmosphere was different. There were longer pauses, a few more questions about Jake's school progress, and a shared, silent acknowledgement of the warmth they had briefly found. Then, the anchor snapped. A few days into the new year of 2026, Mr. Sterling simply did not arrive at 7:15 a.m. David told himself the weather was particularly miserable, or perhaps the holiday rush had simply left the older gentleman tired. But the following day, the corner table remained empty. And the next. A cold dread began to settle in David's stomach. Mr. Sterling was a creature of unflinching routine. David tried to find an address or phone number, asking the manager, but the manager only shrugged, claiming the regulars were not his concern. The simple, honest grief David felt was disproportionate to the length of their friendship, but he mourned the loss of that unique connection, the only person in his solitary world who truly saw him, even without knowing his circumstances. On a bleak, rainy Wednesday morning, nearly a week after Mr. Sterling's last visit, David was wiping down the counter after the initial rush. The air in the harbor grind was thick with steam and the persistent smell of damp wool coats. Suddenly, the front door swung open and the world seemed to tilt. A ripple of silence spread through the cafe, replacing the usual morning chatter. 4 men entered first. They were tall, built like statues, and dressed identically in dark, impeccably tailored suits. They moved with a chilling, synchronized purpose, their gaze sweeping the room like searchlights. 2 positioned themselves near the entrance. The other 2 stood flanking a 5th man who stepped into the cafe. This man, Mr. Harrison, was in his late 50s, his silver hair neatly slicked back, and his charcoal suit looked untouched by the Seattle drizzle. He carried an air of immense quiet authority that seemed to suck the oxygen out of the familiar worn cafe. He held a sleek black leather briefcase. The manager, startled, dropped a tray of spoons. "Can I help you, gentlemen?" he asked, his voice cracking. Mr. Harrison ignored him entirely. His cold, intelligent eyes scanned the patrons and the staff, finally settling on David, who stood frozen by the espresso machine, his damp apron clutched in his hand. Mr. Harrison approached his Italian leather shoes clicking deliberately on the linoleum floor. The two bodyguards followed a respectful few paces behind, creating a strange, impenetrable bubble of corporate power within the humble space. "Are you David Chen, Mr.?" Harrison asked, his voice low and precise, an accent suggesting private schools and boardrooms. David swallowed hard, his throat dry. He could feel the eyes of every person in the cafe fixed on him. "Yes, sir. I am David. I am Mr. Harrison, a senior partner at Sterling & Associates. I was Mr. Alistair Sterling's personal attorney." Mr. Harrison's expression was flat professional. "It is my duty to inform you that Mr. Sterling passed away peacefully in his sleep last Sunday." The words struck David with the physical force of a blow. The room spun slightly. The image of the old man laughing with Jake, his quiet confession of loneliness on Christmas night, flooded his mind. David had barely known him yet. The grief was immediate and sharp. "Oh," David whispered, swallowing his emotion. I'm so very sorry to hear that. He was a good man." Mr. Harrison nodded curtly. Mr. Sterling was meticulous. He left explicit instructions regarding his final will and testament, which requires your immediate presence. A car is waiting outside. David could only stare, confused. "A will. Sir, there must be a mistake. I served him coffee. I have no connection to his estate. There is no mistake, Mr. Chen." Mr. Harrison stated, his voice firm. He leaned in slightly, lowering his voice so only David could hear. "You are the man who cut his English muffin into 4 perfect squares every single morning. He specifically mentioned that detail. Please make arrangements to leave now." David felt utterly bewildered. The simplicity of the detail, the very core of their silent ritual being recorded in a man's will, was surreal. His manager, standing rigid behind the counter, finally found his voice. "Go, David. Just go. We'll manage." David quickly untied his worn apron and tossed it onto the counter. He grabbed his backpack, feeling like he was stepping out of his own life and into a poorly written spy movie. The bodyguards silently formed a protective shield around him as they escorted him out the door and into the waiting sleek black sedan. The drive to the law offices, a glittering skyscraper far from the harbor. Grind's working-class waterfront was a silent, dizzying experience. David was led into a massive, hushed conference room. Waiting there were 2 people who immediately radiated hostility. Victor Sterling. Mr. Sterling's grandnephew was a man in his late 20s, dressed in a custom suit, his face etched with impatient disdain. Beside him sat Eleanor Sterling, Victor's mother, her expression a mask of chilly, entitled curiosity. "This is who we've been waiting for." Victor sneered, looking David up and down, making his contempt clear. "A waiter. My grandfather truly lost his mind." David ignored the insult, taking the seat indicated by Mr. Harrison. The distance between his chair and the Sterlings was vast, intentional, separating 2 entirely different worlds. Mr. Harrison began reading the lengthy will, dryly reciting clauses about trusts, endowments, and properties. The amounts mentioned were colossal, incomprehensible. Finally, Mr. Harrison paused, looking at Victor and Eleanor. "To my beloved grandnephew, Victor Sterling, and his mother Eleanor Sterling, I bequeath the existing Sterling Family Trust, an amount equivalent to $1 million each. This is to ensure their current comfort and address immediate expenses." Victor shot out of his seat. $1 million? That's an insult. The company is worth hundreds of millions. He's trying to punish us. Sit down, Victor. Mr. Harrison commanded, his voice like ice. I am not finished. Your grandfather had full and undisputed control over his assets. Victor glared, but reluctantly sank back down. Mr. Harrison adjusted his glasses and read the final critical clauses, his voice gaining resonance. And finally, to David Chen, the young man who showed kindness to an old man when no one else noticed, and who offered him warmth when his own blood offered only cold obligation. I leave a legacy of faith. First, a gift of $500,000 to ease his burdens and secure his son's future. David gasped, his vision blurring. $500,000 enough to wipe out every debt, to breathe freely for the first time in years. Mr. Harrison continued, his voice calm amidst the sudden enraged protests of Victor and Eleanor. And because I wish for the spirit of genuine kindness to survive and thrive, I bequeath to David Chen the entirety of the business known as the Harbor Grind, which I purchased 6 months ago through an independent holding company, along with the multi-million-dollar investment trust attached to that business. This trust is explicitly designated to ensure the long-term ethical operation, expansion, and security of the cafe and its staff. Silence fell. Victor's face drained of color, realizing this was not just a $500,000 insult, but a massive transfer of control and liquid assets. Mr. Sterling had not only given David the key to a new life, but he had also gifted him a powerful protected seat at the table of the Sterling legacy. The black sedan navigated the maze of Seattle's financial district, climbing toward the glassy towers where power resided. David sat in stunned silence, the reality of the inheritance, $500,000 a cafe, and a multi-million-dollar trust, a vortex of impossibility in his mind. He glanced at Mr. Harrison, the attorney's face impassive and sharp. Mr. Sterling was not a man to leave things to chance. David, Mr. Harrison finally said, without looking away from the passing skyline. He understood that money attracts vultures. He anticipated this conflict. The car stopped beneath a glittering limestone building on the waterfront. This was not the law office. This was Mr. Sterling's private residence. The penthouse was vast, cold, and beautiful. Walls of glass offered panoramic, distant views of the Puget Sound, yet the space felt utterly devoid of life. Priceless artwork, sculptures, paintings by masters lined the walls, illuminated like museum exhibits. It was the gilded cage David had heard Mr. Sterling implicitly speak of on Christmas night. Everything was perfect, sterile, and silent. He conducted all company business at the headquarters. Mr. Harrison explained, his voice echoing slightly in the vastness. This apartment was his sanctuary, though a lonely one. He hasn't allowed family members past the reception area in years. Only his closest advisors were granted access. Mr. Harrison led David down a long, quiet corridor to a heavy, custom-made oak door. The only room that reflected the man, not the mogul, was his study. The antique brass key that David found in the documents opened the lock. David stepped inside and instantly understood the contrast. This room was warm. It smelled of aged paper leather and perhaps a faint ghost of old pipe tobacco. Bookshelves lined every wall, crammed with volumes ranging from history to classical literature, defying the minimalist perfection elsewhere in the penthouse. A worn leather armchair sat beside a fireplace that looked like it was actually used. But what immediately drew David's eye was the wall behind the large walnut desk. It was covered from floor to ceiling with a sprawling, intricate display of photographs, legal documents, stock charts, and handwritten notes, all connected by colored threads. It was the strategic map of a general, detailing the inner workings of an empire. David walked slowly toward the wall, his simple reality receding further with every step. This, Mr. Harrison said, entering the room behind him, is where Mr. Sterling spent his final 6 months. This is your introduction to the Sterling Group. David first focused on the charts. He saw massive lines of aggressive growth followed by sharp, worrying declines. He tracked the threads leading to a section devoted entirely to Victor Sterling. Pinned there was a series of detailed financial analyses, legal memoranda, and communication transcripts from the years 2023, 2024, and 2025. These weren't mere accusations, they were meticulous, documented failures. David saw signed proposals by Victor for high-risk, quick-profit tech ventures that had hemorrhaged millions. He saw reports detailing sloppy management, aggressive hiring based on nepotism rather than merit, and quarterly reports with red arrows pointing sharply downward. David's breath hitched as he grasped the reality Mr. Sterling had not just been lonely, he had been conducting a desperate final audit of his own legacy. Victor was not merely an arrogant grandnephew, he was an active existential threat to the stability of the company due to his short-sighted ambition and management failures. "Your grandfather was brilliant," Mr. Harrison murmured, observing David's expression, but he was also deeply hurt. He saw the company he built being systematically dismantled by the very person who carried his name. David moved to the center of the wall where a small untouched patch of corkboard held a few personal items. There was a faded photograph of Mr. Sterling's late wife, a woman with kind, smiling eyes. Next to it, David saw a recent, slightly blurred photo he recognized instantly. It was Jake, laughing outside the harbor grind, pointing at something in the drizzle. Pinned beneath Jake's photo was a small cream-colored note card written in Mr. Sterling's recognizable shaky script. They valued the name. He valued the meaning. The future of integrity must be guarded by kindness, not by blood. I choose the lasting perspective. Tears welled in David's eyes. This was the motive. Mr. Sterling hadn't just been cutting him a break. He had been searching for an heir whose character matched the ethical foundation he wanted his fortune to rest upon. He was not seeking revenge, Mr. Harrison said, understanding David's emotional state. He was seeking protection. He knew Victor's management style, obsessed with rapid profit, blind to long-term value, and dismissive of the core ethical investments your grandfather had fought to maintain. He realized that a person who values the simple act of cutting toast understands long-term value better than someone obsessed with liquidation. Mr. Harrison pointed to a specific document detailing an impending shareholder meeting scheduled for February of 2026. Victor is making his move. He plans to use his limited influence and the perceived weakness after Mr. Sterling's death to push through a proposal to liquidate high-value but currently low-yield assets, including your investment trust. He sees the multi-million-dollar trust attached to the harbor grind as ripe for immediate extraction. David felt the panic rising, followed by a fierce protective resolve. He wasn't just defending his future. He was defending the final wish of a lonely man who had placed immense trust in him. Mr. Harrison walked to the desk, opening a thick leather portfolio. Mr. Sterling ensured you would not enter this fight empty-handed. He gave you the necessary insight here in this room, and he gave you the necessary leverage. He placed a heavy stack of binders on the desk copies of the detailed analyses David had just viewed on the wall. These are certified copies of the financial dossiers. This is your ammunition. They prove Victor's reckless management. Next, Mr. Harrison produced a small engraved certificate framed in simple silver. And this, Mr. Harrison concluded, handing the framed item to David, as your final weapon. A single share of Sterling Group stock. It grants you the legal right to enter that boardroom, take a seat at the table, and speak directly to the full board and the shareholders. You can't outvote them, David, but you can outreason them. You can show them the truth that Mr. Sterling meticulously prepared for you. David, the tired waiter from the harbor grind, stood amidst the relics of a billion-dollar empire, holding a single share and the proof of a complex betrayal. The weight of the responsibility was staggering, but he remembered the warmth of that Christmas evening and the trusting look in Mr. Sterling's eyes. I understand, David said, his voice quiet but steady. I will protect his legacy. The corporate boardroom was a stark contrast to the small, cozy corner booth of the harbor grind. It was a cathedral of power, a massive obsidian table surrounded by leather chairs, polished to a mirror sheen, overlooking the entire city of Seattle. David Chen, dressed in the best suit he could afford, felt the weight of hundreds of millions of dollars of corporate expectation pressing down on him. He was the single shareholder sitting silently among institutional investors, board members, and analysts. Across the table, Victor Sterling, flanked by his mother, Eleanor, smirked with unshakable confidence. Victor believed this meeting, scheduled for February 2026, was a mere formality, a cleanup operation to reclaim what he felt was rightfully his. Victor rose, radiating a practiced professional charm. He began his presentation, a dazzling display of charts predicting explosive short-term growth. "Ladies and gentlemen of the board," Victor's voice boomed, slick and assured. "And my grand-uncle Alistair Sterling was a man of immense vision, but his final decisions were clouded by sentimentality. Today, we must inject modern efficiency into the portfolio. I propose we immediately liquidate the small non-core assets that are draining our resources, specifically the multi-million-dollar investment trust currently attached to an obsolete coffee shop known as the Harbor Grind." Victor flashed an image of the unassuming cafe on the screen. "That trust is capital tied up in sentiment, generating minimal returns. Liquidation and reinvestment would allow us to capture 40% higher yields within the next fiscal year. We must sever emotional ties to pursue financial optimization." A murmur of agreement ran through several board members. Victor's argument was sound, if ruthless. His motion was seconded, and the chairperson opened the floor for discussion before the final vote. Victor settled back into his chair, eyes dismissive, confident that no one among the high-powered figures present would dare object to guaranteed short-term profit. Mr. Harrison, sitting nearby, gave David a nearly imperceptible nod, the signal to rise. David took a deep breath. His heart was hammering a frantic rhythm against his ribs, but he remembered the clean, organized truth hidden on the walls of Mr. Sterling's study. He stood, his voice, though quieter than Victor's, carrying an unexpected gravity. "My name is David Chen," he began, speaking into the microphone. "I am here today as the designated shareholder and overseer of the trust Mr. Sterling established." Victor let out a harsh, mocking laugh. "The waiter speaks. I believe the rules state we are discussing finance, not dish soap, Mr. Chen." David ignored him completely. He focused his gaze on the chairperson. "I am not here to discuss dish soap, sir. I am here to discuss long-term value and what Mr. Sterling truly meant by legacy. I knew Alistair Sterling as few of his blood relations did, and I understand the difference between value and price." He then began to tell his story. He spoke simply, without flourish, recounting the silent ritual of cutting the English muffin, the small kindness offered without expectation. He painted a quiet, vivid picture of the lonely old man who found a moment of genuine human connection in the bustling cafe. The boardroom grew still. The hard-edged executives used to jargon and forecasts were captivated by the raw human sincerity. And on Christmas Day of 2025, David continued, his voice heavy with emotion. "Mr. Sterling sat in my small apartment among homemade decorations and confessed a profound truth. He told me he felt like an ornament in his own family's schedule. He said they had forgotten how to simply be with someone. He chose me not for my financial acumen, but because I offered him something his entire fortune could not buy: belonging." Victor was fuming, his face red. "This is irrelevant sentimentality. It is a waste of the board's time. It is utterly relevant." David countered, his voice suddenly hard, the chef's precision returning. He gestured to Mr. Harrison, who placed the thick binders containing the detailed financial records on the table before the board members. "Mr. Sterling did not leave me this trust for sentiment," David stated firmly. "He left it for protection. Protection against the very short-sightedness we are seeing today. Victor Sterling speaks of modernization, but the data meticulously compiled by Mr. Sterling himself over the past 3 years tells a different story." David moved to a large screen where Mr. Harrison projected the key pages from the dossier. These records show, David announced, his voice steady, that Mr. Sterling spent the last year attempting to mitigate the damage caused by Victor Sterling's aggressive, high-risk, and ultimately disastrous ventures. Here is the certified proof of millions lost on speculative technology, all under Victor's poor stewardship. Victor is not driven by long-term growth. He's driven by the thrill of immediate massive profit, a pattern that proves him to be a severe financial risk. He paused, letting the silence hang heavy. The board members, initially skeptical, were now poring over the irrefutable data. Their fear of sentimentality was instantly overshadowed by their fear of documented incompetence. Victor wants to liquidate the legacy trust today because he sees it as liquid cash he can immediately deploy into another high-risk project. David concluded, looking directly at Victor, whose arrogance had dissolved into panicked rage. Mr. Sterling chose me, the waiter, not to run the empire, but to be the guardian of its integrity. He entrusted me with a lasting perspective. The silence that followed was broken only by the frantic flipping of pages. David's defense, combining the moral authority of Mr. Sterling's final wishes with irrefutable financial logic, was overwhelming. When the chairperson called for a vote on Victor's motion to liquidate the trust, the result was a swift and decisive rejection. The majority of the board, terrified of the instability Victor represented, voted against him. In the aftermath following a brief recess, the board moved to secure the legacy trust. They realized that David, the unassuming man who had held the old man's trust, was the only firewall against Victor's reckless ambition. David, refusing any executive title, proposed a motion that he be appointed the overseer of the Sterling Legacy Fund to ensure the trust adhered strictly to Mr. Sterling's mandate of ethical, long-term, community-focused investments. The motion passed easily. David Chen, the former dishwasher, had won. In the ensuing weeks, life changed utterly, but in the most important ways, it remained the same. David used the initial capital to pay off his debt, securing Jake's future. He invested in the harbor grind, renovating the kitchen, installing new equipment, and giving the loyal, overworked staff substantial raises. But the most sacred part of the cafe remained untouched. In the corner, Mr. Sterling's favorite booth was restored, not replaced, and David had a small, elegant brass plaque mounted above it, Alistair's Corner, where kindness finds its place. One Saturday afternoon in late March of 2026, David sat with Jake at the corner table. The sunlight, rare and bright for Seattle, streamed through the window. David was teaching Jake to play chess using the antique ivory set Mr. Sterling had left him, the very set Mr. Sterling had wanted to use to teach his own grandson. "Remember, Jake," David said softly, moving a pawn forward. "The king is the most important piece, but he is powerless without the support of the people around him." Jake nodded, eyes focused on the board. The bell above the door chimed softly. An elderly man, thin and slightly stooped, wearing a worn coat, shuffled inside. He looked tired, lost in the noise of the now bustling, cheerful cafe. He approached the counter slowly. David stood up, the weariness that had marked his face for years, finally replaced by calm assurance. He walked toward the elderly customer, a warm, genuine smile lighting up his face. "Good morning, sir," David greeted him gently. "A table for one." "We have the perfect spot right here in the corner." He led the new customer to a small, comfortable table, placing the menu down and waiting for the order. David returned to the counter, preparing the man's coffee, with care, ready to offer not just service but recognition. The true legacy of Alistair Sterling, the legacy of human connection, was safe, thriving, and being quietly continued in the heart of the harbor grind. And so the greatest inheritance David Chen received was not the dollars in the bank, but the perspective to see the true value in quiet, persistent kindness. The story of Alistair Sterling teaches us that the richest legacies are never measured in assets, but in the genuine warmth we choose to share even when the world seems cold. If this tale of simple kindness and profound connection resonated with the quiet truths in your own life, we invite you to join our growing family of listeners. Please consider supporting this channel by subscribing and tell us in the comments below, what is the most valuable kindness you have ever received? We have many more touching tales to share, so be sure to click on the newest video appearing on your screen now.